Okay, so Ron Weasley looks in the Mirror of Erised and sees himself winning every Hogwarts accolade except Prefect. Dumbledore knows this about Ron, so he knows what Ron's greatest desire is. So don't you think it's a bit of a dick move on Dumbledore's part later down the line in the Order of the Phoenix to make Ron a prefect, the one Hogwarts accolade he didn't want? You know, Dumbledore can be a right cruel bastard towards Ron sometimes. Spoiler warning. This is an in-depth retrospective and story analysis of the entirety of the Harry Potter books, one chapter at a time. If this is your first video in the series, it is highly recommended that you begin watching this series from the beginning, which you can do by going to the playlist that I provide right here. Okay, now that everyone is all caught up, let's continue. So the holiday season starts off by pointing out how cold it becomes in the hallways and even the classrooms of Hogwarts. One has to wonder why this doesn't get mentioned in future books in the series. Maybe you could argue that it would be repetitive for this to get mentioned every Christmas season, but then again, Rowling seems content always mentioning the sensation of having a hook pulling you by the belly button whenever you travel by Portkey, despite that being a completely superfluous detail. So why does that detail get repeated nearly every time, but the cold hallways during winter don't? What, did Hogwarts finally get around to installing central heat in the hallways after this year or something? After 1,000 years of being in business? In the days leading up to the Christmas vacation, Ron teaches Harry how to play wizard chess. It's like regular chess, but the pieces are alive. While the rules of chess remain the same, the pieces actually have the ability to disobey the player giving the instructions. However, one has to wonder why Ron waited a full semester to get around to teaching Harry how to play this, seeing as this is something Ron is clearly good at and it's his favorite game. Meanwhile, during breaks, the Golden Trio are searching the library for information on just what Nicholas Flamel is famous for. Surprisingly, the librarian, whose name is Pence, is constantly sending them out of the library even though they are using the library for exactly what it was supposed to be used for. Now, maybe you could argue that it's because Harry was standing too close to the restricted section of the library, but how does that justify him being banished from the library altogether? Also, they decide not to ask Pence where they can find Flamel. This is apparently Rowling's attempt to provide an in-universe justification for why they didn't simply take the obvious, most direct path to getting the information. However, the reason given for not taking that option is dubious at best. Their rationale was that they didn't want Snape to overhear what they were doing. However, they seem to have no problem telling Hagrid what they were doing. How did they know Snape wasn't eavesdropping on that conversation? And what, you couldn't just look around the library to make sure Snape wasn't in the library, and then bend over and whisper the request into Pence's ear or something? Honestly, if you wanted to give an in-universe justification for why they didn't take that quick and easy route, you could easily have written it so that they already asked Pence, and then she put two and two together, realized that the trio were trying to find out what Fluffy was guarding, and then she got mad at them for the same reasons Hagrid got mad at them and then just refused to give them the information. Not only would that have made a lot more sense, but it also would have explained why Pence was constantly breathing down their necks and not letting them do their research. As it stands, we get nada explanation for why she does that. So anyway, Hermione is going back home for the Christmas holidays, while all the Weasleys are staying at Hogwarts. They justify this by pointing out that the Weasley parents are going to see Charlie in Romania. So why don't they want to visit Charlie? Is it because of the dragons? I can certainly understand not wanting to be put in mortal peril by having them be close to dragons, but that also begs the question. Did Ginny, who is still at home because she's too young to attend Hogwarts, get the choice of whether to go to Romania or not? Putting Ginny in mortal peril, are you? I hope to God she was staying with Aunt Muriel while her parents were off facing unspeakable danger just to visit their son. So Harry wakes up on Christmas Day, the same day this video is going up, and no, that's not coincidence, and is surprised to find that he has presents. Ron jokes that Harry must have been expecting turnips. Of course, we know that Harry was expecting to find nothing at his bedside whatsoever. However, Rowling also contradicts this notion just a minute later when she reveals that Harry received a present from the Dursleys. Now sure, it's an insulting present, but it's still a present. Now, both chapters 3 and 6 mentioned how Harry would consistently get insulting presents for his birthday, but for him to expect no Christmas presents at all, that would suggest that the Dursleys almost never gave him any Christmas presents at all. However, the fact that the Dursleys gave him even so much as a coin as a Christmas present refutes this. Clearly, the Dursleys feel socially obligated to give a Christmas present to Harry, even if they hate his guts. So, how is it that Harry was expecting to receive nothing? So then we get to the biggest contribution this chapter makes to the main story. Harry unwrapping and receiving his invisibility cloak. Surprisingly, Ron seems to recognize the cloak immediately as an invisibility cloak, despite never having seen one before. Of course, Ron is the exposition guy, so it makes sense that he would provide the exposition about what exactly this is. It's just weird that he would know something this obscure. Also, Harry gets a handmade sweater from Molly Weasley. We saw in Chapter 6 that Molly was one of the few people who was actually somewhat sensitive to Harry's feelings, and this continues her character development in that regard. Harry receives a note saying that the cloak had previously belonged to his father. However, the note doesn't contain a name. So until the final chapter of this book, the person who gave Harry the cloak will remain a mystery. However, before Harry has a chance to properly soak in the priceless possession he now owns, Fred and George barge into the first year's bedroom and commit a massive invasion of privacy. They force Ron to don his sweater, which begs the question, was he even wearing a shirt beforehand, or did he have to take his shirt off first? For that matter, I thought Ron wore pajamas to bed, and I always thought pajamas were supposed to be one piece. So, does that mean Ron also took his pants off in order to put on the sweater? Does that subsequently mean that Ron was temporarily butt naked in front of everyone? Later on, at Christmas dinner, Hagrid is getting drunk off his ass and plants a big fat wet one on McGonagall. Harry was amazed to find that McGonagall not only didn't mind being kissed like that, but actually giggled. Unlike Chapter 8, it actually makes sense this time around that McGonagall's behavior would be described as rare, because at least in this chapter, Harry has had a full semester to get to know McGonagall and know what is and isn't in character for her. However, later that night, that's when this chapter's actual story gets underway. This is the part where stuff actually starts to happen. Harry remembers the invisibility cloak he got earlier that morning, and he decides to use it to sneak around the castle after curfew. Bear in mind that, in Chapter 9, this was considered an offense worthy of expulsion, so Harry is taking a humongous risk. So I suppose it's a good thing that he isn't involving Ron in this huge risk. But then again, he isn't refusing to wake Ron because he doesn't want to be responsible for ruining Ron's future. Rather, he's refusing to wake Ron simply because he wants to use the invisibility cloak alone for the first time. This is a rather stunning motivation for Harry. Recall that, in Order of the Phoenix as well as Deathly Hallows, whenever Harry prepares to go on suicide missions, he is extremely reluctant to accept help. As I mentioned in Chapter 3, it's one of Harry's biggest character flaws, but at least in those instances, it's out of fear for their safety, so it's at least partially noble. So it is remarkably jarring in this chapter to see Harry refuse to get his best friend involved for no other reason than he just doesn't want to share his toys. He decides to spend all night in the library looking in the restricted section for information on Nicholas Flamel. However, as soon as he opens a book, it starts to scream. It continues this scream even when he shuts the book. You know what I think? I think this is an alarm system designed to help the Hogwarts faculty detect when somebody has entered the restricted section. First of all, what good is a book that screams when you open it? What purpose could that possibly serve, other than to immediately alert everyone within a 1-mile radius that you've opened it? Second, the restricted section of the library has no nighttime security, despite it being the most dangerous part of the entire castle. A malevolent person could find information in this section of the library that he could use to raise all kinds of hell. Like, oh, I don't know, the greatest dark wizard of all time using the restricted section to find out how to make himself immortal? And yet, this place has no nighttime security other than the same teachers who patrol the entire castle, nor is it protected by anything other than a do not enter security tape? Police! Third, the books have no artwork or text on their covers. You would think that this would make finding the book you want rather inconvenient, but perhaps that inconvenience is the whole point. Unless you know some magical means of telling the books apart, like Pence probably knows, you have to resort to trial and error to find the right book, thereby dramatically increasing your odds of stumbling upon one of these alarm books. Fourth, the one time the Golden Trio used the restricted section legally, during Chamber of Secrets when they're trying to learn the recipe for Polyjuice Potion, even then, they aren't allowed in the restricted area themselves. Instead, Pence goes and gets the book they need for them. Obviously, Pence would know which books are alarms and which aren't. So, my theory is that the book is only meant to serve as a means of detecting unauthorized use of the restricted section. So as Harry is running away from Filch and Snape on night patrol, he eventually stumbles upon an unused classroom. In addition to the standard stuff like desks and a blackboard, he also notices an enormous mirror. It isn't stated exactly how tall this mirror is. It's said to be as high as the ceiling, but that begs the question of how high the ceiling is. This is a medieval castle after all, so he can't just assume that the ceiling is built to scale, like modern buildings are. Anyway, Harry notices that the top of the mirror had an inscription at the top. Okay, first of all, how is he able to read the text from that high up? Second, how is he able to see the inscription during the middle of the night? I can understand that his eye pupils might have expanded to allow him to be able to navigate corridors in the darkness, but how many of us can literally read in the dark? Third, the message at the top supposedly says, Erised stra eru oit ube kafru oit on wasi. I'm pretty sure I fucked that up big time. Those of us who really like this series know that this message, when spelled backwards, actually reads, I show not truth but heart's desire. The first word in this sentence, Erised, is literally the word desire spelled backwards. However, why are the spaces mixed up? If you just want to spell the sentence backwards, shouldn't it look something like this instead of this? Anyway, Harry looks in this mirror and sees a whole bunch of other people standing next to him. Harry notices the resemblance between himself and these other people and eventually deduces that this must be his family. Now, I am a big fan of Super Carlin Brothers. Honestly, what Harry Potter fan isn't also a fan of Super Carlin Brothers? However, in their 7-part series on Dumbledore's Big Plan, they suggest that Dumbledore planted the mirror in this room with the express intention of Harry finding it and looking in it. I referenced this big plan series in Chapter 8 of this retrospective series. However, in this instance, I just don't agree. For Dumbledore to have expected Harry to find the mirror in this room would require that Dumbledore know exactly which moves Harry was going to make. Dumbledore would have to have expected Harry, A, to look in the restricted section of the library, B, to get chased out of the library, C, to make the exact turns in the exact corridors that would lead Harry to this room to the exclusion of all other paths, and D, to choose this room to hide in to the exclusion of all other hiding spots. And I'm sorry, but that's just too many things that Dumbledore simply had no way of predicting. Besides, if Dumbledore wanted Harry to look in the mirror just to see what Harry would see, he didn't even need to go through this elaborate ruse of planting the mirror in this random-ass room in the hopes that Harry would stumble upon it. He could have easily just summoned Harry to his office one afternoon and then just showed Harry the mirror. Being prompted to look into it by someone else doesn't appear to have any tangible effect on what you see in the mirror, so it's not like that wouldn't have gotten the job done. Now, the quest to learn about Nicholas Flamel and the Sorcerer's Stone, yeah, I can totally buy that Dumbledore intentionally left those breadcrumbs laying around in the hopes that Harry would follow the trail. But the mirror? No, I just don't buy that this mirror is somehow part of Dumbledore's elaborate plan for Harry. Now, that does beg the question. If it wasn't put there by Dumbledore for Harry to find, then what exactly is the mirror doing there? Well, the short answer is, I don't know. I don't accept the Super Carlin Brothers theory, at least not this section of the theory, but that just means that the mirror's intended purpose remains a mystery. So the next day, Harry is telling Ron all about the mirror and promising to take Ron to see the mirror later that night. What's baffling for me, personally, is how Harry is refusing to even eat any food. Harry, I get that you're overflowing with joy because you finally got to see the family you never had, but why don't you eat something? The narrator makes this seem like the most natural thing for Harry to do in this predicament, but I certainly don't starve myself just because I'm happy about something. For that matter, why wait until later that night? Why not just go right away? You have no classes to go to during the holiday break, and it's perfectly allowed for students to wander the castle during the daytime, so you won't even need the invisibility cloak. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Ron looks in the mirror and sees himself as a highly successful Hogwarts student. He is not only Quidditch captain and winner of the Quidditch Cup, but he is also head boy. However, he does not see himself as a prefect, the one Hogwarts accolade he will eventually go on to achieve. How ironic that even when Ron gets his deepest desire, an achievement that he can call his own, he still draws the short straw even then. Now, I personally have always been raised to believe, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Ron apparently believes in this sentiment as well, because the next day, despite being shown his greatest desire, Ron is not overcome with lust and a desire to return to the mirror, but instead smells a rat because of it. I honestly would find this to be much more compelling if Rowling had any intention of using this as a means of developing Ron's character. Instead, this trait of Ron's will never get brought up again for the rest of the series. It's always Hermione who advises caution and discretion in every other instance. Instead, it just seems that Ron only gets this moment to be the wise person of the group simply because Hermione is currently written out of the story. So on the night of December 27th, Harry goes back to the mirror a third time. Only this time, it turns out that the room is already occupied by none other than the headmaster of Hogwarts himself, Albus Dumbledore. Harry initially thinks his goose is cooked, but much to his, and first-time readers' surprise, Dumbledore is actually smiling. Dumbledore reveals that he has been eavesdropping on Harry and Ron looking in the mirror, since he can become invisible on his own power without the need of an invisibility cloak. Now, Super Carlin Brothers ponders what exactly Dumbledore is doing in this room if he isn't specifically trying to entice Harry to look into the mirror. In their exact words, Dumbledore is just like, guess I'll just be invisible here. However, I once again disagree. Harry is clearly discussing this finding with Ron the next day, and because he is doing this over breakfast, that means he is doing so in the Great Hall. I absolutely can believe that Dumbledore overhears Harry and Ron's conversation, learns about their intention to visit the mirror that night, and then, and only then, does he decide to go and spy on Harry. In other words, Dumbledore was indeed absent for Harry's first visit to the mirror. He only went the second time because he already knew Harry was planning on going there. Dumbledore then explains the mirror's true function. It doesn't just show people what they want, it shows them nothing more or less than their deepest and most desperate desires. However, Dumbledore also impresses upon Harry that the mirror doesn't show the viewer how to obtain what he sees or even whether the thing can be obtained. Because of this, Dumbledore implores Harry not to go looking for the mirror again, and that if he ever does come across it again, Harry will now be forewarned. So with Harry's breaking of curfew kindly forgiven, and Harry learning a powerful lesson about living life, the chapter comes to a close when Harry asks Dumbledore what he sees when he looks in the mirror. Dumbledore lies and says that he sees himself holding a pair of socks. This sets up a big character payoff way down the line, near the end of the series, when we finally find out what Dumbledore actually sees. So this chapter's biggest contribution to the main narrative, obviously, is the introduction of the invisibility cloak. This will become one of Harry's most potent and valuable tools for the remainder of the series. However, I have to opine that this cloak is kind of OP. Sure, it doesn't stop the wearer from being heard or felt, but the fact that it requires little more than simply draping it over your head? Harry doesn't have to master any exceedingly complex spell in order to become invisible like the Patronus charm. He literally just puts the cloak on and poof, baby's first invisibility. I'm sorry, but that just seems a little too easy. Things like this should be balanced. The Polyjuice Potion is a similarly powerful MacGuffin in the story, but at least that's tempered by the fact that the potion is exceedingly difficult to make, and it has to be drunk every hour on the hour in order to maintain your deceptive appearance. Sacrificial protection is one of the most powerful branches of magic in existence, and is the only thing that can protect people from the killing curse. But even that is balanced out by the fact that, in order for this protection to trigger, someone has to willingly die. By contrast, what is there to balance out the invisibility cloak's OP effects? The fact that it's the only cloak in existence that is so powerful? That's not a balance. If this were an MMORPG, then yes, the fact that this cloak is one of a kind would certainly balance out how OP it is. But this entire story is told almost exclusively through Harry's eyes, meaning that the rarity of the cloak does not balance out its uber effects, quite the contrary actually. The fact that it's so rare is in fact just another thing that makes it so powerful. Because it's one of a kind, that means that Harry's enemies are often ill-equipped to cope with the cloak's unique properties. Unlike the Elder Wand or Resurrection Stone, Harry doesn't even go on any kind of quest or prove himself worthy to wield the invisibility cloak. It's literally just handed to him on a silver platter, thereby negating what little balance the rarity of this object might otherwise have provided. Now sure, the cloak doesn't protect Harry from being heard or felt, but that isn't a balance either. If you were playing a video game such as a JRPG and you were to use a cheat code that gave you infinite mana, would you consider that to be balanced simply because that same cheat code didn't also give you infinite health? No, of course not. Because this cloak is so OP, Rowling often has to write in various exceptions, some of them quite arbitrary, to the cloak's powers, such as Moody's magical eye being able to see through the cloak, or the Golden Trio's feet being visible underneath it. Or else just make Harry completely incompetent at using the cloak, like in Chamber of Secrets, when he completely forgets to use the cloak numerous times when it would have been uber useful. The thing is, this cloak needed to be exceptionally powerful in order to justify its status as a Deathly Hallow. But in doing so, Rowling made this cloak too powerful for the story's own good, requiring her to walk around eggshells so that Harry can be properly challenged with it in his possession. Barring that, however, this chapter's primary contribution is the contribution which gives the chapter its name, the Mirror of Erised. Unlike the cloak, the mirror only sets up the climax for this one book, and that's about it. However, after all the time I spent ripping into the cloak, if you think the mirror is getting off scot-free, then I pity you. Granted, I don't have nearly as much to say about the mirror as I do the cloak, mostly because, unlike the cloak, the mirror only appears for 2 chapters in the entire series, so I don't have nearly as many opportunities for the mirror's properties to become developed in the series. However, I do have to wonder, is Harry seeing what his actual parents would look like if they were still alive? Harry doesn't immediately recognize his family for who they are. It takes him a few minutes to piece it all together. So I'm going to assume that the mirror didn't just dig into Harry's psyche, realize what Harry thinks his family would look like, and show that to him, but instead showed what his family would actually look like if they were still alive. That in turn begs the question of how the mirror somehow knows what they all look like when Harry himself does not. At least with Ron, he already knows what the head boy badge and Quidditch cup both look like, so the mirror can pull those images out of Ron's psyche. But then, there's the question of why this mirror was even made in the first place. At least with the cloak, it's obvious why someone would make that thing. It is immediately useful to whoever wears it. But the mirror? All it really does is show people something they can never have. I would really like some supplementary material that gives a proper origin story for the mirror. As for character, Harry obviously gets the bulk of character development in this chapter. He gets taught a valuable lesson by Dumbledore about not forgetting to live, a lesson he desperately needed to learn since his obsession with the mirror extended far beyond simply wanting to go there every night, but also in his failure to do literally anything else during the day, even when he wasn't pursuing the mirror. Ron somehow just already had those lessons learned, and this character maturity just comes out of nowhere. Maybe it's because he grew up with a loving and supporting family who already taught him all those life lessons before he even got to Hogwarts, whereas Harry only had the Dursleys who never taught him jack shit. But even then, this honestly seems to be the wisest that Ron ever appears for the entire series. Like I said earlier, it's clear that Rowling was actually writing for Hermione's character, but then Hermione was written out of the story for the latter half of this chapter, so Ron got this line instead. Next time, ladies and gentlemen, we'll finally catch up with the elusive Nicholas Flamel, and we'll also be introduced to the MacGuffin that this book is named after. So tune in next time when I discuss Chapter 13, Nicholas Flamel. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later.